So hi everyone. Thank you so much for joining Ten2Two today for our member webinar on interview tips to secure the job. As experts in flexible and part-time recruitment and consulting, we have a wealth of experience in this area, and we would like to share some of this with you now. We will also follow up with a handout and a link to a recording of the session, so there's no need to be writing too much down at the moment. I'm Jane O'Gorman, Director of Ten2Two, and your co-host today, and I will be keeping an eye out for any questions that you may have during the session, and you can pop these on the Q&A below. And we'll try and get to as many of those as we can. Now, we only have 30 minutes for the webinar, plus some added time for those questions. So without further ado, I would like to hand you over to my lovely colleague, our MD, Deborah O'Sullivan, who will kickstart the session. Deborah, over to you.
Lovely. Thank you, Jane, and hello, everybody. As Jane said, this is going to be rather quick, but hopefully we'll give you a coverage of everything that you need to think of if you've got an interview coming up, or you're hoping you're going to have an interview coming up, or you just want to refresh yourself. So let's just have a quick look at what we're going to be covering. This is the agenda. So we're just going to quickly talk about, why an interview, in terms of preparation, what you need to do, the basics and the content. We'll very quickly look at interview question types, spend a little bit of time on answering competency-based questions because we get a lot of queries about that. Then we're going to move to on the day, some basics and some questions, including some of the trickier questions you may have been asked in the past. Then a quick summary and then questions. So that's what we're hoping to cover. And I will just keep cracking on. So why an interview? It's still the main method of recruiting. So even though there's been some movement in the market over recent years with video and testing and psychometrics, really nothing replaces that face-to-face interview. And it serves a number of purposes. Most of them are obvious, but I think it's worth reiterating. From a client side, the employer is looking to see, does that person that you meet in person match the paperwork? So this is where you have to make sure your CV actually does match what you represent. It's an opportunity for a really deep dive into your skill set and how you might approach tasks. And it's a test for fit on both sides. And I think this is really important. When people talk about being interviewed, it always seems very one-sided. It's the employer asking the questions and the candidate answering. Actually, it's really important you go along and see whether it is good for you, the culture, the fit, the role. And actually, we are seeing more and more candidates say, do you know what, I didn't really like the people, or I don't think the culture is right for me, or even the content of the job isn't quite what I thought it was going to be. So always go along with that in mind, thinking, okay, I'm going to see if I want this. And actually that takes some of the nerves away if you go in with that attitude. It's a chance for you to evaluate the company and the role. It's a great opportunity for you to understand more about the role because you get quite a lot from the job ad or the job description, but there's nothing quite replaces sitting in a room with people who work at the company. And of course, simply, it's an opportunity to visit the workplace where you may or may not be spending quite a lot of time. So on to some basics, and these do sound really basic, so I apologise, but you'd be surprised how many times we get feedback from clients where either some or all of these things haven't been done by the candidate. So I'll quickly touch on them. The first one is the most important, which is researching the company and the industry. There's really no excuse today for going along to an interview not knowing some very basics about the company, checking out their website, press releases, their social media, seeing what their customers are saying about them on social media is really quite interesting. And then looking at their sector, doing a little bit of research, are they doing well in their sector? Have they got a good reputation, a bad reputation? All of those things help you understand more about the role you're going for and the company you're going to be meeting. The next most important thing is the people that you're going to meet. So again, with social media, it's really easy generally to find the people who are going to be interviewing you, check them out. You never know, you might have studied at the same school, you might live in the same area. There could be all sorts of things in common. And if you don't know who's interviewing you, then ask. It's a perfectly reasonable question. If you're working through an agency such as 10to2, we always tell you who you're going to be meeting with their LinkedIn link. And if you're going directly, it's fine to ask the HR people, who am I meeting? What's their job titles? How does the role fit with them? And then place. I've got some really funny stories here, but we haven't got time to tell them. But what I should say is just make sure you know where you're going. We have had examples where people have gone to a head office rather than the branch office. We've had people turn up and there'll be nowhere to park, all residence parking. They've had to park 20 minutes away and miss their interview slot. So the thing around the place is make sure you're going to the right place, make sure you know whether there's parking or transport links, you know how to get in the building, particularly if you've got an out of hours interview. Sometimes you need an access code or telephone number. So always check those sorts of things. And then finally, dress. Again, we could probably do a whole hour webinar on this. If you haven't been in the workplace for a while, chat to friends who are, to see what is sort of normal in the workplace. Our rule of thumb is always be smart. So you don't really see very many suits now, but smart is always the safest place to go, unless you're going for a creative role in maybe an advertising agency or something like that. Blouse, skirt or trousers, maybe a blazer or a cardigan, that works. Good tip is to look at the website, see what the people who work there are wearing, and that should give you a fairly good indication of what to wear. And just under that heading of dress, I'd also say if you're a smoker or a vapor, try not to do it too close to your interview. Try not to wear too much perfume. We have had one candidate come back and say that the interviewer said to her, "Oh, I recognize that perfume, it's my ex-wife's." So you don't really want situations like that if you can avoid them. And then finally, jewelry. Just be wary that you're not wearing any jewelry that's going to be distracting as you're talking if you're gestating with your hands. So they're the basics, which I know probably most of you already know, but I think it's worth touching on. So then the most important preparation is the content. How are you going to show the company that you're the best candidate for the job? And what can you do for the job and the company? They're the things you need to think about. And the best way of doing that is to review the job description or the job ad. So it depends, you might not have both. The job description or the job ad has been carefully crafted by somebody in the department who knows what the job is. So it's generally a really important document, and it does tell you virtually everything you need to know about the role. So really look at that carefully, and then look at your CV. And you do want to know your CV inside out, but you really want to know your CV in relation to the job description that you're going for. So you want to do this matching process between your job description and your CV. So if it's saying we want teamwork, then in the job description, find areas on your CV where you know you can give an example of great teamwork, and then you know it'll be relevant when you're asked in the interview. And go through the whole job description doing that. If you're serious about the role, it's really helpful, because more than likely the hiring manager will use the job description as the basis for the questioning. So it just means you're very well prepared and you can relax on the day. So when I talk about thinking of examples to support the key areas, top tip for thinking of those examples is to think of 2 or 3 times in your professional career where you've either managed a project or had some success that you could draw maybe 4 or 5 examples from. So say you managed a product launch, you might have examples of leadership, teamwork, initiative. So it's much easier in an interview in a high pressure situation to remember that project and draw examples from that project rather than thinking about your whole career. So my top tip there is to try and think of 3 key achievement areas from your career and pull your examples from those. And then finally, know your motivations and reasons. So if the interviewer says to you, why do you want this job? Make sure you've got a good answer for it. Or why is this company attractive to you? Now, obviously, sometimes it might be that they're offering flexible hours and it's local. And that's fine. That's a good reason to go for a job, but that isn't what the hiring manager wants to hear. He wants to hear why you will love the company and do a brilliant job for them. So think about how you'll answer those questions. So that's your prep before you go to interview. What types of interviews might you come across? I've listed them here. I'll quickly talk through them. What I would say is it doesn't matter what type of interview you've got, really, you still need to do the same level of prep. You might have a telephone or video interview, which is usually an early stage part of the process. But if you don't pass that, then you won't get a second stage interview. So you sort of need to do all the prep up front. Telephone and video interviews, they are usually early stage. They are normally quite short, 15, 20 minutes. And it's more of a sense check to check your CV against what you're saying on the phone or on video. Most common by far since the pandemic and before the pandemic is face-to-face. So usually 1 or 2 people face-to-face, an hour or so asking questions. You can get panel and assessments. We personally don't see them so much here, but I know they still go on. They're often for big public sector jobs or charity jobs sometimes. So the most common thing we see is a video first stage and then a face-to-face second stage and then offer. For more senior positions, sometimes we'll see a task or an assessment as a third stage, sometimes with psychometrics added in. But like I say, whatever you come across, the prep is still the same. So, types of questions. I'm racing through here. I hope that's okay. Types of questions. So, questioning in an interview is all based on the premise that your past behaviour is the best indicator of how you'll perform in the future. I mean, it sounds obvious, but once you know that and they're asking you a question, it helps you understand that what they're looking for is evidence. The interviewer is asking for evidence of how you have behaved in certain situations on the basis they think that's how you'll behave in the future. So there's a number of question types, and I'm going to quickly touch on them all here. It's a bit like the interview types. Don't worry about, oh my God, they've just asked me a behaviour-based question. What's interesting to know is why they might be asking it. So that's why I'm covering it here. But actually, you can answer them all pretty much the same using the examples that you've prepped. So straightforward, first one that's often asked is around your work history. And what the interviewer is trying to do is establish the basic facts against your CV. So it might be, can you briefly talk me through your CV? So it's a good opener for an interview. It establishes a bit of a rapport. It allows you to get over those initial nerves and talk about yourself. But practice it, because actually sometimes, particularly if you've had a career of 15 years plus, briefly talk me through your CV is actually quite a challenge. So practice it. Think, okay, how could I summarize my CV in relation to this role in a few minutes? Because that's what they're looking for. They don't want chapter and verse everything you've done. So then the second type of question is competency based. And these types of questions are looking at the skills needed to perform the job and whether you've got them. I've got another slide about competency based and how to answer them. But the types of questions might be something like, tell me about a time when you supported a colleague who was struggling with an area of work. So that's looking for teamwork. They want you to give them an example, show how you handled it, to test whether you have actually ever done some teamwork in your past and what your approach would be. Another example might be can you give me an example of an experience that reflects your commitment to customer focus? Now, that could be, you might be front of house, you might be greeting customers, you might be nowhere near customers, but you can still have a customer focus. So that's what that question is asking for. So then there's behavioural types of questions, and the slight difference between that and competency is it shows how a candidate, how you would think in a given situation, how you might think, and then what you might do. So here's a type of question. Give an example of a time when you didn't meet a goal and how you handled this. So that's talking about you haven't achieved something you set out to do, and what did you do? So how resilient are you? So you can see it's not a skill. It's not a competency, it's more about how you behave. Another example of that is tell me about a time when you had to persuade someone resistant to your direction to perform a task. So again, that's a more difficult situation that they want you to talk about how you've managed people in your team or people who work for you. And then finally, we have values, and value-based questioning is just seeking to see whether your values match theirs. And actually, they're quite important the other way around to see whether the company matches your values, whether you want to work there. So you might have something like describe, if one of the company's values is integrity or honesty, they might say something like, could you describe a situation where you have demonstrated integrity? Or more broadly, they might say, tell us about a time when you've worked for an organisation that has matched your values. So they're asking you to talk about what your values are in context of a business. So they're the sort of main types of questioning. And as I said at the beginning, don't worry about the categories. It's much more about understanding what the interviewer might be seeking from you by asking those types of questions. So I'm going to go on to answering competency-based questions. And actually, this works for behavioural questions as well, actually. And you might or might not have heard of the STAR method, which is literally just a way to structure your answer. I'll say it another time, you don't need to get hung up on this. It really is just a little structure that can be very simple. So I thought I'd use an example to try and get it across. But basically, the idea is that they say, tell me about a time you faced adversity. And what they want you to do is outline what happened, as in what situation you found yourself in, what action you then took, and then what was the result. So it wraps it all up nicely in a package. So the example we often use in our face-to-face workshop to that question, so tell me about a time when you overcame adversity. I would say, I'm a marketing manager. We had big events coming up. We'd created loads of marketing leaflets, which had a special offer on for our clients. So that's the situation. We arrived 12 hours before the event started. And what happened was I noticed the brochures didn't have the right information on the offer was wrong, incorrect, and would have cost the company a lot of money. What did I do? So what action did I take? Well, what I did was I called the printer who had printed them incorrectly. They couldn't help. I found another printer local to where the event was who could help. We got the artwork to them really quickly. They turned the print job around. It was perfect. I went and picked it up, and we had the brochures ready for the event, which started that evening. And the result was the event went very smoothly. We actually got 5 new customers from that. So that's a very quick way of showing how you can answer a question using that structure. And it works pretty much for most questions. When you're answering the questions, try and always do it in respect to the job or the department that you're interviewing for. If you can, you might not have any experience relevant, but if you have, then please use it. Be clear and concise. So try and, back to that thing at the beginning where I said, think of your examples when you know you've had success in your career. It's much easier if you can draw examples from something in your head already. It helps you to be much more clear and concise. So,
Sorry, Deborah, can I there's just one, some questions coming through, one in particular here around the STAR method,
yes.
And examples. And basically, here's an example. I'm returning to work after a career break and struggling to really remember some old examples that I can use to answer a competency-based question, which we often come across. More recently, I've been volunteering. So is it appropriate for me to use some of that experience and an example from that in this particular scenario?
Absolutely. I mean, if you've had a lengthy career break and volunteering has been your thing, definitely. You know, what you're doing is demonstrating skills and behaviors by answering these questions. So the context actually is not the most important thing. Great if you can use a very relevant example, but not necessary. And if you can, I mean, I do know it can be quite hard to remember some of your success stories, but another tip is to, if you've kept your old annual appraisals or you're still in touch with people you used to work with, that's a good way of reminding yourself, you know, what you did work on and what was successful, because it does start coming back to you once you start thinking about it.
Great, thank you.
Okay. Fab. So we're up to the day of the interview. And I've got a long list on the basics, but I'm going to touch on them all again, just because we know sometimes these get forgotten. So if you've got a video interview, test the tech. So make sure your tech is working. Actually, more recently, we've been saying to candidates to test the link, because sometimes you open the link just before your interview and realize it's not there. And check your background. So make sure that your background is either blurred or there's nothing too distracting in it. And what I would say is, please try and do a video interview either on an iPad or a laptop rather than your phone. Now, I appreciate some people only have their phone. So if you do only have your phone, make sure it's stable, that it's propped up somewhere. It's very distracting trying to interview someone if the phone is moving about. So top tip. An obvious one, but turn your mobile phone off, whether it's a video interview or a face-to-face. Arrive with time to spare. That's that whole point about finding parking, getting entry to the building. You just don't want to do anything that's going to stress you out. And actually on that point, we have had instances where candidates go to interview, it's going really well, and they've ended up staying much longer than they planned. So you should always, I would hope, get an idea of how long the interview is. And as I said, it's normally around an hour, but sometimes it goes on. So try not to squish too much at the back end of the interview. If you've got to pick kids up or be somewhere else, try and allow a little bit of leeway there so that you're not too stressed. Remember body language. So you want to be positive, you smile, nice handshake. I don't know if you guys know about the Superman pose, but it's supposed to give you confidence. So rather than sitting huddled in a waiting room chair, go to the toilet, stand with your legs wide, hands on hips, shoulders back. Apparently it gives you confidence. I'm not sure if it works. there's research that says it. Mention distractions. So if there's something in the room that's distracting you, whether it's a wobbly chair or the sun in your eyes, then just mention it. It's absolutely fine, and the interviewers will want to make you comfortable. And the thing I should say there is actually often the interviewers are just as nervous as you. So yeah, don't be afraid to mention distractions. This really is an obvious one, but we actually have had client feedback that says, oh, they seemed a bit bored. They didn't really seem very interested in what we had to say. So appear interested when the people are talking to you. And your mind might be elsewhere through nerves, but try and nod, agree, appear interested. Listen carefully. You don't want to misunderstand the question. Answer questions directly. So try not to beat around the bush. It's back to that clear and concise. You know, the interviewer's only got a short period of time to get to know you, and you want to get as much information about how brilliant you are across in the short time you've got. Be honest. So I knew I was going to do this. So that's about, if you don't answer, if you don't understand the question, then don't be afraid to say, sorry, I don't quite understand, or could you rephrase that, is a nice way to say it. And then take your time when you're answering. So pause if required. Sometimes the question might be quite complex. We're trying to remember an example. So it's fine to have a little bit of silence while you gather your thoughts, and then you can answer directly rather than waffling. Stay positive about your previous employers. And sometimes this can be hard. But a hiring manager really doesn't want to hear your moans about what went wrong in your last job and how horrible your manager was. So either be neutral or be positive. And then always maintain professionalism. So even if the interviewer you think is being really casual, really relaxed, joking about, remain professional. It's just safer. Show you're keen. So if the interview's gone really well, actually what happens is the hiring managers get excited. They call us, they're all really excited. We want to make an offer. And sometimes they'll say, oh, we don't know if she's interested, or, you know, he actually didn't seem that keen. So if you are keen on the job after the interview, make sure you show it. And then shake hands and smile. Body language all the way to the end. So that's on the day basics. And then, of course, on the day, you're going to have to answer some questions. So you've done all your prep. You've got all your examples in your head. What I would say is practice describing your strengths and characteristics, because I think actually this is more of a problem with women, but it's often quite hard to talk about yourself in a salesy way, which is confident but not cocky. And I think it really helps if you do that to a mirror yourself or do it with a friend. So know how you would describe yourself. As we talked about earlier, most important is know your CV and job description inside out. That will give you the most confidence. If you do nothing else, that's the thing to do. If you've researched the company and the department and the job, use your research to tailor your answers. And know your agenda. You know, what do you want to get across? You obviously you can't control what the interviewer's going to ask you, but if you know what you want to get across, hopefully you'll be able to sneak those in as you're answering questions. I call this trickier questions, but I just know there'll be lots of you out there who probably want the answers to these. So because we have these conversations all the time. So if you've had a career gap, turn it into a positive. So what I would say is you don't need to linger on it, but definitely don't apologize either. What you want to do is talk about it in a way that says, well, I had a career gap between X and Y, and what I learned in that time was, or what I did in that time was, and hopefully you'll be able to pick an example relevant to the role. So back to know your agenda, you'll be using examples that reinforce that. And what I should say about gaps actually is, since the pandemic, lots of people have got lots of gaps on their CV because of what happened during the pandemic. So it's very, very common now. If you're asked about salary, if you're going through an agency, then that conversation will have happened in the background already. So the hiring manager will know what your salary expectations are, and you'll know the budget. If you're doing it directly and it comes to interview and they ask you, then my suggestion is that you give a ballpark figure that you would be happy with, but say you're very flexible and open to discussion. And you can turn it around and say, well, what level of budget do you have? Because I'm very flexible, and have a conversation about it. Then we've got a couple of questions here. The flexibility question, the childcare question, and the two senior questions. So I'll just take those one by one. Flexibility, what you want to try and get across if you're going for a part-time job or a remote job is that you understand what that means, and you've hopefully done it before, or you absolutely think you could. So again, in your answering, what you want to do is cover that off. Having worked remotely before, or, you know, I've worked part-time for 5 years, so I'm really productive and efficient. I know how that works. If you've gone for a full-time job looking to negotiate flexibility or part-time hours, I would always say gauge the mood. So if they've mentioned flexibility during the interview, then that could be an opportunity to talk about it. If not, you might want to wait to be called for another interview before bringing it up. Childcare, you should never be asked about childcare. It's actually illegal, but we still do hear that hiring managers do. And our advice here is that you just say, oh, there's no need to worry about that. My childcare's never been a problem. It's all sorted. So you answer it, but don't go into any detail. And then the too senior questions. So again, we see this a lot where people want to downscale, either because of work-life balance, because of flexibility, just for a change. So there, your job is in the interview is to persuade the hiring manager that you won't take their job, that you won't be bored, and that you think the job is the perfect fit for you. So those things overcome if the hiring manager is worried about you being too senior. And then what you want to do is ask some great questions. Oh, sorry, go back. So on the handout, we'll put a couple of examples, but the obvious one at the end of an interview is to say, what are the next steps, or how long will it be before I hear? But it's good if you can have 2 or 3 up your sleeve that are more directed to the company and the role. So it might be something like, I notice you've just received funding. How does that impact your 5-year plan? I notice you've just opened another branch. Have you got other expansion plans? So things that show you've done your research, you understand what does it mean for the company. And you only need 1 or 2. And actually, if you're engaged in the job and you're really keen, you'll probably have loads of questions that will come to mind during the interview. So summary, preparation is key. So as I said, that's the most important thing. Spend time on your CV, analyze the job description, but don't forget the basics. Tailor your answers, so know how to describe yourself and your achievements in the context of the role and company. So try and draw it back to the job in hand all the time. Ask great questions, so get some in advance that demonstrate how keen you are. And then relax and enjoy. But try and be yourself, smile, good eye contact, introduce some humor if you can. It is a 2-way process, and you want to make sure the job is right for you too. So thanks for listening. Sorry, I'm slightly over. We can move to questions.
Great. Yeah, we've had thank you very much, Deborah. We've had a number of questions coming through, some that I've been answering as we've gone through the process here. There's a few here if we could cover now. So reverting back to some of the points you made earlier, in the sense of, for example, showing you're keen. So, well, how is a good way to show you're keen? Follow up, or something that you say at the end of the interview?
I would say at the end of the interview, before you do the actual leaving part, you say, I've really enjoyed meeting you. The culture sounds great. The role seems like a perfect fit for me. I do hope I've told you everything you need to know, or something like that.
Great. Thank you. There's a number of questions, and I know we've touched on it, around being too senior. I think there's a little bit of concern there about how to convince hiring managers about being the right person for a role if your experience demonstrates that you could actually take on more responsibility. And it's, should I downplay my experience? I know you've already touched on it, but I think just in terms of a recap on that, there's been a number of questions around that particular area tonight.
Okay, I mean, I've got, perhaps on the handout, I'll put a couple of little examples of some of the things you can say in that situation. So my first thing is that if they've got your CV and they've asked to interview you, then they're interested in you. They're not obviously looking for a grad with no experience if they've called you for an interview. Now, I guess if the hiring manager just can't overcome some of those concerns, it won't matter what you say. I mean, that's just a fact. But we have this conversation a lot with clients, and the things they say is, oh, she looks a bit too senior. They often don't ever articulate that they think you might be bored and leave or want their job. But I actually think the best thing to do is in interview to actually say those things so that they know you've considered them. So you say, I did earn more before. I was more senior in my previous life, but I'm really not looking for that anymore. What's most important to me is flexibility and being close to home. And I'm very prepared. I worked my way up before. I'm very happy to get my hands dirty and work at a practical level. I'm not looking to take anyone's job. I love the idea of this role. It's that type of language which will persuade an interviewer that you won't, because hiring someone is an expensive thing to do, both in time and money. So they don't want to waste their time thinking that you will leave. So if they think you're going to take their job, there's nothing you can say, but you could still say it. But I think it's about using that type of language which says, I've thought about this. I know you're thinking about it. I'm going to address it now.
Yeah. And I think you touched earlier on in the interview being open in terms of around the subject of salary. And I think sometimes there's a little bit of hesitation with companies. If it looks like you've got much more experience, actually, are you expecting more? And if the company are very clear about what their budget is, then that's something that I would accept. And obviously in an interview situation, if you've already put yourself forward for a role and you know what the cap is, to be very careful about having conversations and interview that unsettles the interviewer. If you suddenly start pitching a budget above that, and then they think you're on a different conversation. So
yeah, it's a good point, Jane, because actually sometimes they'll say, what did you earn before? And actually what you want to say, I mean, assuming you're not using it as leverage, assuming you are happy with the advertised salary, what you want to say is, I have earned more previously, but that's not what's important to me now. I'm very happy with the advertised salary, because that is one of the big client concerns, is that they're going to make an offer and actually you're going to go, actually, I need 10K more. And that's probably actually the biggest thing when you're too senior that clients worried about. So, and if they ask you directly what you used to earn, you can't lie about that. So I think that's the answer, is to say, it's just not my priority anymore.
Yeah. Again, this particular question here lends itself to perhaps this area as well, in the sense of, if I've been with one company for a very long time, how do I make this a positive spin rather than seen as negative? I think maybe the concern that, have you settled, or are you ambitious? What's the reasons for you being in one position? But how can I make that positive?
I mean, lots of clients do see it as a positive. I would say, I guess it depends on the length of time. But I mean, one of the key things to mention, if you've been in one company a long time, normally you will have had a number of jobs. So actually, one of the things I would always say is, yes, I know I've been there 20 years, but actually it's like working for 20 different companies. I moved every 2.5 years. And every job was different. Every department had its own culture. And you explain it, because I've worked in a corporate, so I know that is the case. But if you're interviewing with someone who's maybe in a smaller business, never worked in corporate, they will just think it's one homogenous thing. So it's probably worth explaining that, and trying to pick the job in your career with one company that is most similar to the job you're going for, because then you can say, your job is asking for this. That's exactly what I did when I worked in this department. So you try and persuade them that it isn't one company, it's actually lots of companies, and actually you've done roles just like the one they've got.
Yeah, well, we often see that when actually what it is that someone has progressed through. You can very much see that transition. It just happens to be within the one geography and one country.
Absolutely.
And actually, for sure, I'm just moving on because we've got so many questions here and I'm conscious of time. One other one here, can you take notes with you to an interview?
Yes. So often people will say, can I take my CV? Which, yes, I mean, you can take whatever you like. I think you need to be careful, because what you don't want to do is disrupt that body language, that eye contact, the rapport building by looking at your notes or scribbling notes or checking your CV. You really do want to know your CV well enough to not need to do that. If you're on a video interview, obviously it's much easier because you can have your notes to your side. But if you're face to face, if it makes you feel better, take them. If you think you won't perform well without them, take them. I try not to.
Yeah, and I think often we see, obviously, if there's some practicals or presentations, then you're going to need documentation there, and it's a different scenario.
Yeah.
And we're definitely seeing that a lot of the interviews used now tend to be perhaps an initial video and then that face to face. So you would hope that perhaps by the time you get to that second stage, you might feel a little bit more comfortable. You'll have met some of the people in the organization, so hopefully there'll be less need for that. But I think, again, it does depend on the role and, as you say, what the particular use would be in that occasion. I would love us to have more time here to actually run through the questions. We will have a look through and try and get to as many of them as possible, but sadly, we don't have any more time at the moment. We will have to wind up for now, but as I mentioned previously, we will be following up with a recording, a link to a recording of the session, and there will be a handout too. I know there's been several questions about whether there would be a handout, and rest assured that will be following through, and you will get a link to the recording as well.
And Jane, perhaps if there's some common questions that we haven't managed to answer, we can just put them at the bottom of the handout so people can see the answers.
Absolutely. I mean, that's exactly what I think we should do. There's several here, and there are some common ones.
Okay,
so,
cool.
So although we have volume, we very often see similar questions coming through. It's just, unfortunately, time is against us, but I'm very grateful for everyone joining us this evening. And it's really lovely to see so many questions coming through. So we will do our best to have a look at those before we get run out of time here. But thank you everyone so much for joining us this evening. Thank you, Deborah, for your great presentation.
Thank you.
We will follow up. I'd just like to say, do get in touch if you have any questions, and we do hope that you will join us again for another 10-2 webinar soon. Have a good evening, everyone, and you can have your cuppa now.
Thank you.
Bye.